verde como una manzana.
Hola amigos! In this lesson, you'll learn the basics of Spanish conjugation. If your goal is to learn to speak Spanish, this may be the single most important lesson that you watch. First, we'll begin by illustrating how the idea of conjugation already exists in English. Then, we'll work with regular AR verbs to show you how it works in Spanish. In the following lectures, we'll add the other two verb categories of ER and IR verbs. Before we get started, let's take a look at our first stop in Spain. Can you guess what we're looking at here? Does the phrase tilting at windmills ring any bells? Here, we are looking at the majestic windmills that were immortalized in the world-famous Spanish novel Don Quixote de la Mancha, written by Miguel de Cervantes, published in two parts in 1605 and 1615. The delusional self-proclaimed Spanish knight charged after these windmills, convinced that they were hulking giants with intent to destroy him and his faithful servant Sancho Panza. From this memorable encounter, we get the phrase tilting at windmills, where the image of Don Quixote charging forward with lance in hand to battle the giants is often used to refer to the confrontation with an imagined enemy. Okay, let's leave our noble knight for the moment and begin our lesson on AR verbs. Conjugation refers simply to the modification of a verb based on a particular context. Verbs are action words like eat, sleep, and work. The infinitive form of the verb is simply the verb in its unconjugated state. Now, once we put the verb into a context, it can undergo modification, or as I'll refer to it as conjugation. Let's take a look. What form of the verb to run would be needed in this context? If you said runs, that would be correct. And how about this context? The correct answer is run, without the S. But the question is why? If both contexts describe the act of running, why do we have different forms? The answer lies in the fact that verbs are very closely related to other parts of speech. In the previous contexts, there's a linguistic connection between the form of the verb, or the conjugation, and the person. In the first example, we have a case for the third person singular in English. In the second example, the second person singular is used. We might then deduce that English verbs change form depending on person. Let's test our hypothesis in another context. In the first example, eats with an S is required. In the second, we omit the S, just like we did with the sentence, you run very fast. In the first example here, we have another use of the third person in English. In the second example, we actually see a use of the first person plural, but it still requires a different form of the verb. So, as a summary, in English, and with respect to person, we usually either see a form of the verb with an S when dealing with the third person he or she, or a form of the verb without the S in the other persons, I, you, we, and they. The same idea exists in Spanish conjugation, but in Spanish, we have a much more robust system of conjugation. It is important to understand that pronouns are words that replace nouns. It's important to familiarize yourselves with the concept of the pronoun, or person, because they will serve as the backbone of the conjugation system in Spanish. Let's take a look at something called the conjugation tree. Now, I know this looks very overwhelming, but as you continue to learn about conjugation, this diagram will become your best friend. For now, just take a look at the layout and pay special attention to the pronouns that each box corresponds to. So let's take a look at this conjugation tree in action. Depending on whether I want to say I talk, or in Spanish, yo hablo, he, she, or you talk, él, ella, or usted habla, we talk, nosotros hablamos, or they or you all talk, ellos, ellas, and ustedes. A different form of the verb is needed. This box here is reserved to indicate how the second person plural form of the verb would be conjugated. This particular box is called the vosotros form, but because it is used primarily in the country of Spain, we'll focus on the other 5 conjugation forms for now. This form here is used to express the second person singular, but is reserved for when addressing someone directly in an informal setting, as when talking to a friend or a family member. This form is called the tú form. This form of you, or usted, has the same meaning as tú, but is reserved for formal encounters, for example between two people who have just met, strangers, or when speaking to your elders. For our next stop, we'll head north just a bit to the historic city of Toledo. In Toledo, we'll take a look around El Museo de Ejército, or Army Museum. As explained earlier, Don Quixote was a self-proclaimed knight who had embarked on an epic quest for honor and glory. As we take a look around at the Spanish armor, imagine Don Quixote himself, fully clad in a glimmering set as he charges off into the distance to take down the giant windmills. Okay, amigos, let's head back and finish our lesson on AR verbs. Let's talk for just a brief moment about roots and suffixes. Conjugation in Spanish is relatively systematic in that depending on the category of the verb, in this case, an AR verb, we need only to learn the conjugation suffixes in order to manipulate any verb according to context. This starts with identifying the root of the verb. The root of any Spanish verb is everything but the last two letters, like you see here. To conjugate the verb, then, we remove the original suffix and replace it with its corresponding conjugation. So for the nosotros, or we conjugation of the verb hablar, we would remove AR from the original form of the verb and replace it with its new suffix, amos. Once you've learned the suffix, amos, you can then use it to conjugate any regular AR verb in the present tense. And what about the other standard suffixes? Here we have the conjugation suffixes for the other forms. These are the conjugations that you would use to replace AR from the unconjugated verb form in order to use it in your desired contexts. Alright. There's a lot of new information for you to take in, so let's do a recap of some of the important concepts. Conjugation is changing the form of the verb according to the context of the sentence. All regular AR verbs in Spanish will take a standard set of suffixes in their conjugated forms. Okay, let's work through some questions together. According to the subject pronoun you see here, what conjugated form of the verb in parentheses would be needed? If you said toca, you would be correct. Let's have another look at that conjugation tree to check which form is needed for ella. Remember that the root of tocar, or toc, is carried through all of the conjugations. What changes is that suffix according to the context in which you want to use the verb. Let's have a look at another question. According to the subject pronoun you see here, what conjugated form of the verb in parentheses would be needed? The correct answer, according to this particular context, is practican. Let's have a look at the conjugation tree for practicar. You'll see that the root of practicar, or practic, has been carried through to all of the conjugations, and that the conjugation suffixes are the same as those used for tocar. Now, I'll throw you a curveball here for this final question. Do you know which conjugation form would be needed according to the context here? The correct answer would be the nosotros form, or trabajamos. This illustrates the fact that even if the word nosotros is not explicitly used in the sentence, the subject of my brother and I still corresponds to the pronoun we, or nosotros. This brings us to the conclusion of the basic introduction to conjugation in Spanish, with specific reference to the conjugation forms of AR verbs. Hasta luego!